Okay, we're taking you now to the United Nations General Assembly, where the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is addressing world leaders.
Certainly didn't stop the USA and their allies from getting the then leader of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, in 2008 to unleash an armed aggression against the people of South Ossetia and Russian peacekeepers. And a further 3 years after that, NATO organized the military intervention in Libya, destroying its statehood and undermining the stability of neighboring countries. In 2015, the UN Summit on Sustainable Development adopted grandiose plans to combat poverty and inequality, but they turned out to be empty promises in light of the reluctance of the countries of the West to refrain from their neo-colonial practices of mining the wealth of the entire world for their benefit. Just look at the statistics of the promises that were kept in terms of financing the development of the countries of the Global South and the transfer of environmentally friendly technologies. Just like Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon in the past, the current Secretary General advanced his own initiative under the slogan of rebooting global cooperation. It's an excellent slogan. Who could be opposed to that? But what global cooperation can we really talk about at a time when the West has trampled all of these unshakable values of globalization that they've been telling us about for so many years from this rostrum, trying to convince us that they would ensure equal access for everyone to the goods of contemporary civilization? Where is the inviolability of property, the presumption of innocence, freedom of speech, access to information, fair competition on markets with understandable and unchanging rules? The Secretary General is talking about global cooperation at the same time as the countries of the West have unleashed a veritable sanctions war against a good half, if not the majority, of states in the world. And the dollar, which was advertised to us as the heritage and good of all of humanity, has been grossly transformed into a weapon. For more than 60 years, there has been a trade blockade of Cuba, the cancellation of which the overwhelming majority of members of the international community are calling for in the pursuit of the ever more ephemeral aim of preserving their domination. Washington is blocking the normal work of the World Trade Organization on dispute settlement and reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, the structures of which for a long time now have not reflected the real balance of forces in the global economy and finances. The West also wants to transform the UN into a tool for advancing its mercantile plans. As was shown by the Summit of the Future, there are more and more attempts to erode the intergovernmental nature of the organization. Long necessary changes in the staffing of the Secretariat are being held back. Key posts in the Secretariat are now essentially occupied and handed down to representatives of the Western minority. If the Secretary General is calling for a reboot of global cooperation, then the Secretariat must advance unifying ideas and propose compromise options rather than coming up with excuses to introduce into the UN's work narratives that are beneficial to the West. Breathing new life into the UN, it's not too late to do that. But in order to do that, we can't have unrealistic summits and declarations. Rather, it must be done through rebuilding confidence and trust on the basis of the Charter principle of the sovereign equality of all member states. However, as long as confidence is being undermined, for the time being it is, and the actions of the West to create in circumvention of the UN narrow formats that are subordinate to it to resolve subsidiary fateful issues such as internet governance and artificial intelligence. But those problems affect the future of all of humanity, and they must be considered on a universal basis without discrimination or trying to achieve unilateral advantage. That is to say that there must be an honest negotiation involving all members of the UN, rather than the way that the so-called Pact of the Future was prepared for, without a single plenary round of negotiations that all countries would be involved in. But instead of that, the work was carried out under the control of Western manipulators. As a result, the pact, even before it was born, had already joined the pantheon of declarations that sound nice in English. Sad as it is, that is the fate of products of these world summits. However, things aren't any better when it comes to implementing Security Council resolutions, which are binding. The sabotage of decisions on the Kosovo settlement and the Dayton agreements on Bosnia and Herzegovina says a great deal. But the most glaring example continues to be spinning out over almost 80 years the consensus resolutions on the creation of an independent Palestinian state coexisting in peace and security with Israel. There can be no justification for acts of terrorism, which Israelis fell victim to on the 7th of October last year. But everyone who still has a sense of compassion is outraged by the fact that the October tragedy is being used for the mass collective punishment of the Palestinians in the form of an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. The killing of Palestinian civilians with American weapons must immediately be ended. It is important to ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid to the enclave, the reconstruction of infrastructure, and most importantly, it is important to guarantee the realization of the legitimate right of the Palestinians to self-determination and to allow them, not in words, but in deeds, as they say, on the ground, to create a contiguous and viable state within the 1967 borders with its capital in East Jerusalem. Another glaring example of terrorist methods as a means of achieving political aims is the inhumane attack on Lebanon that transformed civilian technology into a lethal weapon. There must be an immediate investigation into this crime, but already we cannot remain silent in the face of the many publications in the media, including in Europe and here in the United States, that indicate to varying degrees the involvement and at the very least awareness of Washington when it comes to the preparation of that terrorist attack. And we understand that the Americans always deny everything, and they do everything they can to hush up any facts that come to light, as they did in response to the irrefutable evidence of their implication in the terrorist attack on the Nord Stream gas pipeline. Those gas pipelines, incidentally, were a marvelous symbol of that selfsame global cooperation that our Secretary General dreams of. But as a result of their destruction, the competitiveness of the European Union in the global economy has been undermined for long years to the benefit of the United States. It is on the West's conscience as well that the truth about those who organized many other heinous crimes has been put on a back burner, including the bloody provocation in the Kiev suburb of Bucha and the series of poisonings of citizens of Russia in Britain and Germany. The UN Secretariat cannot remain separate from efforts to establish the truth in situations that directly impact global security, and in doing so is obliged to strictly observe Article 100 of the UN Charter, to act impartially and to avoid the temptation to play into the hands of individual states, particularly those that are actively calling not for cooperation, but to divide the world into the flowering garden and the jungle, or to those sitting around the table of democracy and those that are on the menu. We mustn't forget also about the service record of those that demand that their rules be implemented by the rest of the world. The invasion of Afghanistan and the inglorious 20-year presence there of the infamous coalition was accompanied by the formation of Al-Qaeda. A direct result of the aggression against Iraq was the creation of ISIL. Unleashing the war in Syria gave rise to Jabhat al-Nusra, which is now Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and the destruction of Libya opened the floodgates for the permeation of terrorism into the Sahara-Sahel region and for the flow of millions of illegal migrants to Europe. We call upon all of those that are thinking about the future of their peoples and countries to be very wary of any new escapades by those who invented these rules. We are particularly concerned by the now almost commonplace practice of political killings, as once again took place yesterday in Beirut. The tragic and unacceptable turn of events in the Arab-Israeli conflict in Yemen, in the Red Sea Basin, in the Gulf of Aden, Sudan, and other hotspots in Africa reflects an indisputable fact. Security can either be equal and indivisible for all, or it won't be for anyone. An understanding of what would seem to be a simple truth in the context of European security is something that Russia for years has been trying to impart to Washington, London, and Brussels, who are obsessed with their complexes of their own exceptionalism and impunity. Although they initially promised not to expand NATO, and in 1999 and in 2010 they signed in official documents of OSCE summits an obligation to not ensure their security at the expense of others. In fact, the North Atlantic Alliance for 3 decades has been carrying out the geopolitical and military expansion of NATO into Europe.
Okay, so we've just been listening to quite a wide-ranging speech that is still being delivered by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, addressing world leaders at the United Nations General Assembly, extremely critical of the international community, including the United Nations itself, which he accused them of there being this effort to kind of introduce narratives at the United Nations that are essentially to the benefit of the West. He mentioned the collective punishment of the Palestinians in Gaza, of the humanitarian catastrophe that they are suffering. And then he also kind of listed off a plethora of armed groups that have sprung up in countries from Syria to Iraq to Libya that have essentially been created or have come to life as a result of outside foreign Western intervention in these countries. Let's bring in Gabriel Elizondo, who's at United Nations headquarters in New York. So a great deal of condemnation and criticism in that speech we heard, Gabe. But what is interesting is that there has been, I'm curious at the UN if there's much conversation about the need for reform, and particularly for United Nations Security Council reform after the war in Gaza, also the war in Ukraine, the need to give developing countries more of a say in the body.
Yeah, that's right. This is really the first time in decades that we've had some real serious talk about Security Council reform. And in fact, that was part of the Pact for the Future that was signed off unanimously by the majority of member states of the United Nations on the weekend before this UN General Assembly started. They said, we, as a world body and as the members of the United Nations, agree there needs to be Security Council reform, talking about at least 3 permanent spots on the Security Council for countries from Africa, as well as expanding perhaps the Security Council itself. Even the United States, which has been reluctant to give up its veto power, and by the way, they still have said they will not give up their veto power, even the United States has agreed to and put up forth a proposal about supporting at least 3 African countries to be permanent members of the Security Council, as well as a small island nation on a rotating basis. So this all comes back to Gaza, and that is why this talk on Security Council reform has ramped up so much, because clearly the Security Council has failed when it comes to Gaza, primarily to 3 times, not once, not twice, but 3 times that the United States has used their veto power in the past 11 to 12 months to block Security Council resolutions that would have called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. So that's why we're seeing more discussions about this now.
And there are now also fears of an impending humanitarian catastrophe that is actually already playing out in Lebanon. What's been the reaction there? Has there been much of a response to the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah?
Yeah, we actually just got a statement from the spokesperson for the Secretary General. I just got it as I was walking here into the studio where I'm at. So this is new information, and I'll just read it. It says, this is from the spokesperson for the Secretary General of the United Nations, and the statement says, the Secretary General is gravely concerned by the dramatic escalation of events in Beirut in the last 24 hours. The cycle of violence must stop now, and all sides must step back from the brink. The people of Lebanon, the people of Israel, as well as the wider region cannot afford an all-out war. The statement goes on to conclude by saying the Secretary General urges the parties to recommit to the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701 and immediately return to a cessation of hostilities. The Secretary General reiterates his call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the release of all hostages held there. That's a statement that just came in from the spokesperson for the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres.
Thank you so much. Gabriel Elizondo reporting to us from the United Nations, where the General Assembly of World Leaders is continuing.